Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I see on the agenda so many of my friends all assembled in one place at one time. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be than in Jerusalem. But I'm stuck here in Washington, D.C., so I'll make the best of it with this video. I'm going to focus my remarks on American policy exclusively. And I'd like to try to put it in a broad historical context for you. I see the Oslo Accords as a manifestation of a certain American style of peacemaking. I see a certain DNA running through Oslo, or I see a DNA in Oslo that runs through American peacemaking from Harry Truman all the way up to Joe Biden. And I would like to isolate and discuss that DNA. And I'd like to say in particular that I think it produces a certain strategic pathology. At its worst, it produces a strategic pathology. It can do some good under certain circumstances, but there's this propensity toward pathology that I would like to discuss because I'm a bit concerned about it right now. So first, let me go back to Harry Truman. You all recall that when Harry Truman wanted to support the UN partition plan in 1947, and then wanted to recognize Israel in 1948, that he came up against very stiff opposition from the State Department. But of course, it wasn't just from the State Department. It was from the Defense Department, the intelligence community. In fact, the entire national security establishment was against it. Why? Well, they had their strategic argument. Their strategic argument focused on the rebuilding of Western Europe. The priority of the United States in the Cold War, so the argument went, was to rebuild Western Europe. That project required a steady flow of Middle Eastern oil at reasonable prices. The Middle Eastern oil was in the hands of the Arabs. American support for Zionism was alienating the Arabs, pushing them toward the Soviet Union. And that was in turn going to imperil potentially the reconstruction of Europe. I think that strategic argument, though, comes after a decision to be anti-Zionism, a decision that was not really rationally based or strategically based. It was sociologically based. All of the people in the national security establishment who worked on the Middle East were either the children of missionaries, American missionaries working in the Middle East, or they were educated by those missionaries. Moreover, the missionaries themselves were Protestant modernists, and Protestant modernism was the religion of the American elite. So there was a deep cultural predisposition to accept the arguments of the missionaries working in the Middle East. Before they ever became American officials, when they were just missionaries on the ground, they saw themselves as unofficial representatives of American culture. And they saw their goal of their mission was to create bridges across religious divides. They were not there. I'm talking about by the time we get down to the early 20th century, they were not there to proselytize and to bring Muslims to Christianity, maybe bring some Orthodox Christians to Protestantism, but even that impulse was diminishing. The real impulse at that point was to build bridges across cultural divides, focusing on their Protestant modernists. They're focusing on good works, on health, education, feeding the poor, and so on and so forth. They wanted to find those strains in Muslim culture that corresponded to the strains in American culture that they represented and build bridges across the divide. And they saw Zionism as destroying those bridges. The association in the minds of local Muslims of the United States with the Zionist project was making the missionary project impossible. So they thought. Once the missionaries actually became not unofficial representatives of the United States, but official representatives, as ambassadors and intelligence agents. Then they simply projected their missionary project onto the government of the United States. Their goal was to build bridges across divides in order to put together a coalition to contain the Soviet Union, and Zionism was wrecking the project. This created an ethos, which, and this is the DNA that I think is running through American peacemaking from 48 all the way down to today in some ways. The ethos, which is I call the honest broker paradigm, or the honest broker agenda. The missionaries first, and then their representatives, their descendants who were ambassadors and intelligence officers, argued, and this is their term, the United States should be an honest broker in the Middle East. It should. Now that sounds like what they mean is the United States should be an impartial mediator between Arabs on the one hand and Israelis on the other. But that's not what they meant. What they meant is that the United States should contain Israel. It should weaken it. It should force territorial concessions on it. It should convince the Arabs that it's not going to arm it. It should convince it not to take in too many Jewish immigrants. It should keep Israel small, weak, and contained. And the United States should present itself to the Arabs as the party that is going to do that. That was the argument. Those were the arguments that led President Eisenhower in 1957 to roll Israel back when it took the Sinai. Now, you could have imagined a very different attitude on the part of Eisenhower. By the time the Suez Crisis came, and by the time Israel attacked together with the British and French, or in parallel with the British and French, in late 1956, Nasser was already aligned with the Soviet Union. So you might have imagined a President Eisenhower who would say that Israeli military power, the conquest of the Sinai, is a lever that the United States has over Nasser, and the United States should use it to pull Nasser away from the Soviet Union. That he cannot count on American support for an Israeli withdrawal until the United States sees that he moves away from the Soviet Union. Eisenhower didn't accept that logic. Didn't accept that logic at all. Now, in the Nixon administration, or it's not until the Nixon administration that we get an alternative view. I mean, a clearly articulated view, and that's the view of Henry Kissinger and of Nixon, that Israel is indeed an asset, not a liability, and we should use Israeli power as a lever, just as I mentioned, to pull Egypt away from the Soviet Union. That is the policy, that is the strategy that leads to Sinai Disengagement 1 in 74, Sinai Disengagement 2 in 75, and I would argue it's also the strategy that ultimately leads to the Camp David Accords. But Jimmy Carter was like the guy who runs in front of the parade at the last minute and then gets the credit. He takes the parade past the bleachers with all the cameras and takes the credit for having organized the parade. The parade was created by the Nixon-Kissinger strategy that pulled Egypt away from the Soviet Union. But Carter was there to carry it across the finish line. And as a result, he gave a big boost to the honest broker ethos. You'll remember that Carter in the Camp David Accords created the framework for peace. The framework for peace is the fundamental basis on which the Oslo Accords are developed. It's the framework for peace that talks about the creation of a Palestinian Authority and then the United States brokering negotiations between the two. But what got lost between Framework for Peace and Oslo was the strategic rationale that Nixon and Kissinger so intelligently articulated. That the goal of the United States is to create a stable order, an order in which our ally Israel can manage its security concerns. That strategic rationale, the relations between states gets lost, and there's just a mania for negotiation in the honest broker ethos. A mania for negotiation that is disconnected from any sense of strategy whatsoever. That is the That is the pathology. There's an inclination to present the United States to the Arab world as the instrument by which it's going to roll back Israel. The attitude increasingly is not that Israel's a terrible liability, but that it needs to be saved from itself. That was an article by George Ball in the 1970s. The goal of American policy is to save Israel from itself. So the American officials in the 1990s, even in the 1970s, I don't think they see themselves anymore as descendants of the missionaries. They're not even aware that a lot of their attitudes originally came from the missionaries. But there's just this sense, which comes from where God knows, that the goal of the United States, that the role of the United States in the Middle East is to process peace. It's just assumed that if the United States plays that role, it will have great strategic benefits for the United States. But there's no larger strategic concept that is discerning when is a good moment to try to broker peace and when is not a good moment. When Henry Kissinger started the process with Egypt, he had received an enormous number of signals, very clear signals from Sadat, that Sadat was willing to compromise. Those signals have not come to us from the Palestinians. They've certainly not come from the Syrians at any time since. Now, if the United States takes a posture where it presents itself to the Palestinians and the Syrians as eager and waiting to help roll back Israeli power, which is what the honest broker ethos instills in American diplomats, if it shows that posture, it does two things. Number one, it disincentivizes the Palestinians and the Syrians to make concessions. Number one, and number two, it incentivizes violence, because if the relations between Israel and its neighbors heat up, the other side can expect the United States to step in, begin mediating, and begin putting pressure on Israel to make concessions. That's the honest broker. That's the honest broker ethos at its worst. As I mentioned, there are times, such as Carter and Egypt, where the bilateral, or there was at least one moment, that is Carter and Egypt, when the bilateral relationship between Egypt and the Israelis was cooked enough so that honest broker ethos actually was helpful at that moment, because it gave presidential attention to the negotiations. But when you add, when it's just an inclination that's disconnected from any strategic sense and from any clear sense that the other side is really ready to make a deal, then it's pathological. And that, unfortunately, I think is more the norm than not. Now, for years, the pathology hasn't been that detrimental, because the stakes haven't been all that high. Now, I would say the great exception, of course, being the Second Intifada, when a very large number of Israelis died. But we're moving toward something that is much more like the Cold War again, with the rise of Russia, Iran, and China, this growing coalition, with the introduction of disruptive military capabilities into the region. And I'm not just speaking about the Iranian nuclear capabilities. I'm also talking about Iran's ballistic missiles, its drones, and its cruise missiles, combining them together in the same strike packages. This is creating a very volatile atmosphere. It's very dangerous for the United States to be embarking on Oslo-like activities in such a circumstance. But that's what I see it doing. What the Biden administration is doing by the normalization, by promoting normalization with Saudi Arabia in the way that it is doing, it is actually bringing the Oslo process back through the back door by tying the two things together. And it's using that in a very cynical way. I think it's a kind of a shiny ball, the normalization with Saudi Arabia, that's throwing in one corner of the room while it is in the other corner of the room cutting a deal with Iran. The strategic play today is for the United States and Israel to focus on Iran, to bring pressure to bear on it, for the United States to use Israel as an asset in the struggle with Iran. If it does that, all of the other stuff will take care of itself, or it won't. But the United States doesn't need to step up and announce to the whole world that it's here to try to roll Israel back, whether it's in Lebanon or whether it's on the West Bank. If that's going to happen, it'll happen in its own time, and we'll know the signals when we see them, just as we just as we recognized them when we saw them from Sadat. Thank you very much. I think I've probably gone over time here. I'll stop. Again, I really wish I could be there with you. I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and I hope that I put a few ideas on the table that can be helpful to it. Have a good conference, and I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.